March 17, 1943. The North Atlantic rolled under a sky the color of old iron and aboard HMS Hesperus. Radio operator Tommy Sullivan stood in the cramped communications room, listening to signals that shouldn't exist. The convoy, designated HX, 224 stretched across 12 square miles of gray water, 47 merchant ships loaded with fuel, steel, aircraft parts, and ammunition bound for a Britain that was bleeding resources faster than the convoys could replace them. Intelligence reports confirmed at least 6 U-boats forming a wolfpack somewhere in the dark waters ahead, coordinating their attack through encrypted radio bursts that standard Allied equipment could barely detect until it was too late. Sullivan pressed the headphones tighter against his ears, his fingers hovering over equipment that would get him court-martialed if anyone knew what he had done to it. But he heard something, a faint transmission on a frequency the Germans thought was invisible to surface vessels. His modified antenna, installed in secret 3 nights earlier, was picking up coordination signals between submarines that were supposed to be ghosts. Tommy Sullivan grew up in a row house in Liverpool where the walls were thin enough to hear 3 families arguing at once. His father worked the docks, loading cargo that would cross the same ocean Tommy now protected. As a boy, Sullivan became obsessed with radio after finding a broken receiver in a junk shop. While other kids played football in narrow streets, he soldered components by candlelight, teaching himself circuit theory from library books written 20 years earlier. He understood radio waves not as abstract physics, but as living things with personalities and moods. He knew that signals bent around obstacles, that metal structures created shadows and reflections, that polarization mattered in ways the official training manuals barely mentioned. When war came, Sullivan enlisted immediately, scoring high enough on technical aptitude tests to skip basic training and land directly in signal school. But even there, he frustrated instructors by questioning doctrine. Why did patrol vessels use horizontal antennas when U-boats transmitted on vertical polarization? Why did standard equipment ignore frequencies the Germans were known to use for short-range coordination? The answers were always the same. Doctrine exists for good reasons. Standard equipment has been tested. Individual modifications create chaos. Do your job, operator. Follow the manual. But Tommy Sullivan had watched convoys burn. In January, he stood on deck as HX. 217 lost 9 ships in one night. Torpedo wakes appearing from nowhere. Escorts scrambling to respond after the killing had already started. One of those ships carried his cousin's husband, a merchant sailor who never came home. In February, Convoy SC-119 lost 8 vessels, and Sullivan's own ship picked up survivors who described underwater explosions they never saw coming. U-boats firing from positions that should have been detected miles earlier. The official reports blame bad weather, equipment limitations, the vastness of the ocean. But Sullivan knew the real problem. Allied forces were listening for U-boat transmissions with equipment designed for surface communication, using horizontal antennas that were almost deaf to the vertical polarization German submarines used for their tactical networks. It was like trying to hear a whisper while wearing earmuffs, and men were dying because of it. On the night of March 14th, while HMS Hesperus was docked in Newfoundland for resupply, Sullivan made his decision. He waited until the duty officer was ashore, and the other crew members were either sleeping or drinking in port. Then he climbed to the highest accessible point on the superstructure with a coil of copper wire, a handful of insulators he had scrounged from damaged equipment, and a homemade matching network he had built from components that officially didn't exist in his inventory. The ship's standard direction-finding antenna was a horizontal loop optimized for surface targets. Sullivan's modification was elegantly simple and completely unauthorized. He strung a vertical wire antenna from a masthead down to the deck, carefully isolating it from the metal structure to prevent grounding. The antenna was a quarter wavelength vertical, precisely cut for the frequencies German U-boats used for short-range wolfpack coordination. He connected it through his matching network to a secondary receiver input that was rarely used, then carefully documented the frequencies and signal characteristics he expected to see. The entire installation took 4 hours, and when he was finished, HMS Hesperus had an antenna system that existed in direct violation of Royal Navy regulations. For 2 days, Sullivan monitored his forbidden antenna while maintaining his regular duties on the standard equipment. He heard nothing unusual at first, just atmospheric noise and distant commercial traffic. But on the morning of March 17th, as Convoy HX 224 formed up and began its voyage toward Britain, the modified receiver crackled to life. Short bursts of Morse code on frequencies the standard equipment couldn't properly receive. Sullivan's German was functional, learned from intercepted transmissions and prisoner interrogations. These signals were tactical updates, wolfpack forming, contact reports, position estimates. The U-boats were coordinating an attack, and they were much closer than anyone realized. Sullivan faced an impossible choice: report what he was hearing and admit to unauthorized equipment modifications, facing certain punishment and possibly sabotaging the intelligence before it could be verified, or stay silent and watch the convoy sail into an ambush. He chose a middle path. He approached the officer of the watch with a carefully worded report. Possible submarine transmissions detected on secondary equipment. Bearing approximately 270. Range uncertain, but signal strength suggests close proximity. He didn't mention the modified antenna or how he was receiving signals that shouldn't be detectable. The officer was skeptical, but professional. Standard direction finding equipment showed nothing unusual. Sonar contacts were negative, but standing orders required investigation of any potential submarine activity. So the escort commander dispatched 2 corvettes to sweep the reported bearing while the convoy altered course slightly to the south. Sullivan returned to his station, continuing to monitor both the standard equipment and his secret antenna. What he heard over the next 2 hours confirmed his worst fears. The U-boats were adapting to the convoy's course change, repositioning themselves for a night attack. Their coordination signals increased in frequency and urgency. He could track at least 5 distinct stations, possibly 6, forming a patrol line directly across the convoy's projected path. The wolfpack was setting a trap, and without his modified antenna, no one would know until the torpedoes were already in the water. By mid-afternoon, Sullivan had logged 13 separate transmissions from the wolfpack. The signals painted a clear, tactical picture. The U-boats were forming a classic rake formation. Individual submarines spaced at intervals calculated to ensure at least 2 would have firing positions on the convoy, regardless of its maneuvering. The coordination was professional and disciplined, exactly the kind of operation that had devastated previous convoys. But this time, the hunters didn't know they were being heard. Sullivan's modified antenna gave the escorts an unprecedented advantage. For the first time in the Battle of the Atlantic, a convoy commander could track U-boat movements before the attack began. The question was whether anyone would believe the intelligence, and whether Sullivan could continue to provide it without revealing his unauthorized modifications. He filled page after page of his log with technical details, carefully noting signal bearings, estimated ranges based on signal strength, and patterns in the transmission timing. He presented the data as coming from careful monitoring of standard equipment, exploiting the fact that most officers didn't fully understand the technical limitations of their own radio systems. Commander Donald McIntyre, the senior officer commanding the escort group, was not most officers. He had survived 2 years of convoy battles, sunk 3 U-boats, and developed an instinct for when something wasn't adding up. He appeared in the radio room at 1700 hours, studied Sullivan's logs in silence, then asked the question Sullivan had been dreading. How exactly are you receiving these transmissions? Operator, the standard HFDF shouldn't be picking up tactical frequencies at this range. Sullivan felt his career hanging in the balance. He could lie, obfuscate, hide behind technical jargon that most officers wouldn't understand. Or he could trust that McIntyre cared more about saving the convoy than enforcing equipment regulations. He chose honesty. Sir, I made unauthorized modifications to the antenna system. A vertical wire optimized for the frequencies U-boats use for coordination. It's receiving signals the standard equipment misses. I know it's against regulations, but I can track the wolfpack in real time if you'll let me continue. The silence that followed seemed to stretch forever. McIntyre's expression was unreadable, his eyes moving from Sullivan to the equipment to the logs and back again. Finally, he spoke. Show me exactly what you did. Sullivan explained the theory. German U-boats use vertical whip antennas for their tactical radios, which meant their transmissions were vertically polarized. Allied surface ships use horizontal antennas optimized for communication with other surface vessels and aircraft. The polarization mismatch meant that standard equipment was partially deaf to U-boat tactical signals, especially at the lower power levels used for short-range wolfpack coordination. A vertical antenna changed everything, making those signals clear and trackable. McIntyre listened without interruption, then asked the only question that mattered. Can you maintain continuous tracking? Can you give me bearing updates accurate enough to position escorts for preemptive strikes? Sullivan didn't hesitate. Yes, sir, I can. What happened next entered unofficial Royal Navy legend, but never appeared in official records. Commander McIntyre made a decision that could have ended his career as easily as Sullivan's. Instead of reporting the unauthorized modification up the chain of command, he chose to exploit it. He gathered his escort captains for an emergency conference, explaining that they had real-time intelligence on U-boat positions and an opportunity to reverse the usual dynamic of convoy warfare. Instead of waiting for the wolfpack to attack and then responding, they would strike first. The plan was tactically brilliant and operationally risky. As darkness fell, 3 escorts would break formation and conduct a high-speed sweep along the bearing Sullivan provided, using active sonar to force the U-boats underwater and disrupt their attack coordination. The remaining escorts would tighten their screen around the convoy, ready to respond to any submarine that slipped through. Success depended entirely on whether Sullivan's modified antenna was giving them accurate information. If his bearings were wrong, they would scatter their defensive screen chasing ghosts while the real wolfpack slaughtered the convoy. At 2100 hours, as full darkness settled over the North Atlantic, the operation began. Sullivan sat in the radio room with 3 officers crowded around him, calling out bearings as German transmissions crackled through his headphones. 268 degrees, signal strength increasing, multiple stations coordinating. 315 degrees, single station, possibly trailing the formation. 042 degrees, weak signal, likely the wolfpack commander maintaining position astern. The escort commanders translated his reports into tactical movements with practice efficiency. HMS Hesperus and 2 corvettes accelerated to flank speed, racing toward the reported positions with active sonar pinging through the dark water. The first contact came at 2132. Sonar reported a solid return at bearing 270, range 3,000 yards, classified as submarine. The U-boat crash-dived immediately, but depth charges were already arcing through the air. The explosions lit the night with columns of white water, and Sullivan heard the German tactical network erupt in alarm. Contact lost with Boat 4. Enemy escorts attacking. All boats take evasive action and submerge. The wolfpack's coordination shattered. U-boats scattered, diving deep to escape the unexpected assault, abandoning their carefully planned attack positions. But Sullivan could still track them. Even submerged, the submarines occasionally transmitted short status reports to their commander. Each transmission gave away their position, and each position report let the escorts maintain contact. For 6 hours, the battle continued as a deadly game of cat and mouse played out in 3 dimensions. HMS Hesperus and her consorts hunted submarines that had expected to be the hunters, dropping depth charge patterns guided by Sullivan's interception of their own communications. At 2315, sonar reported breaking up noises at bearing 310. A U-boat had suffered critical damage and was sinking. At 0 to 30, another submarine surfaced 4 miles from the convoy, pumping oil and unable to dive, before scuttling itself to avoid capture. The remaining U-boats withdrew, their attack broken before it could begin. As dawn broke on March 18th, Convoy HX 224 continued eastward toward Britain, without having lost a single ship. The victory was unprecedented. For the first time in the Atlantic campaign, a convoy had detected and defeated a wolfpack before the U-boats could strike. The merchant captains didn't know why they had survived. The official reports would credit aggressive escort tactics and favorable sonar conditions. But every officer in the escort group knew the truth. One radio operator and his forbidden antenna had changed the rules of engagement. Sullivan remained at his station through the night and into the following day, monitoring for any sign the wolfpack might regroup. He intercepted fragments of German transmissions that revealed confusion and fear. How did the British know our positions? Are our codes compromised? One submarine reported possible radar contact before the attack, but the rangers were wrong for standard surface search radar. The U-boat commanders didn't understand what had happened to them, and that confusion was almost as valuable as a tactical victory. Commander McIntyre filed a carefully worded after-act report that mentioned improved direction-finding techniques without specifying exactly what those techniques were. He recommended that Sullivan receive commendation for exceptional performance of duties, but he didn't mention the unauthorized antenna modification. The report moved up to the chain of command, and within weeks, signals intelligence officers began quietly visiting escort vessels to discuss improved methods for detecting U-boat tactical communications. Sullivan found himself giving unofficial lectures on antenna theory and polarization to radio operators who had been taught that doctrine was absolute. He explained his modifications a dozen times to officers who asked careful questions while taking detailed notes. Nobody officially approved what he had done, but nobody ordered him to remove the vertical antenna either. It remained in place, and HMS Hesperus continued to demonstrate uncanny ability to detect U-boats before they attacked. By April, 3 other escort vessels had quietly installed similar vertical antennas. By May, the modification was spreading through the escort groups as word-of-mouth knowledge that existed outside official channels. Radio operators talked to each other during port calls, sharing circuit diagrams and installation techniques. Officers who understood the value of tactical advantage looked the other way, while unauthorized modifications appeared on their ships. The Royal Navy's official doctrine didn't change, but the reality of what equipment was actually being used at sea diverged significantly from what the manual specified. Sullivan's improvisation was becoming standard practice through an informal network of operators and commanders who trusted empirical results over institutional procedures. The impact on the Battle of the Atlantic was measurable. Convoy losses in the North Atlantic dropped significantly in the spring and summer of 1943. German U-boat commanders reported increasing difficulty coordinating attacks, with escort vessels appearing at their positions before attacks could develop. Allied intelligence intercepted German naval communications, discussing possible compromise of tactical codes and frequencies, but the Germans never identified the real problem. They couldn't imagine that their polarization choices had created a vulnerability that a single creative radio operator had learned to exploit. In June, Sullivan was quietly transferred to a signals intelligence unit in London. The transfer order cited his technical expertise and value as an instructor, but the real reason was to get him off a combat vessel before someone in the bureaucracy noticed the irregular equipment and started asking formal questions. In London, he worked with engineers and intelligence officers to refine the vertical antenna concept, developing improved designs that could be officially approved and widely deployed. By late 1943, new escort vessels were being built with vertical direction-finding antennas as standard equipment, though the official documentation carefully avoided mentioning that the design had originated with an unauthorized field modification. The doctrine had finally caught up with reality, but the institutional memory conveniently forgot how that reality had been created. Sullivan trained dozens of radio operators in the new techniques, teaching them to listen for the signals that standard equipment had been designed to miss. He explained polarization theory and antenna design to men who would take that knowledge to sea and use it to save convoys. But his own role in developing those techniques was never officially acknowledged. The statistics told the story that individual reports concealed. In the first quarter of 1943, before Sullivan's modification spread to the fleet, U-boats sank an average of 50 merchant ships per month in the North Atlantic. By the third quarter, after improved direction finding became widespread, that number had dropped to fewer than 20 ships per month. The U-boats were losing the Battle of the Atlantic, and one of the reasons was an antenna that had started as an unauthorized experiment by a radio operator who questioned why things had to be done the way they had always been done. German naval intelligence never fully understood what had changed. They knew that Allied convoy escorts had become dramatically better at detecting U-boats, but they attributed it to improved radar and sonar technology. They never realized that their own tactical communications, which they believed were secure due to polarization mismatch with enemy equipment, had become transparent once someone thought to install the right kind of antenna. Tommy Sullivan returned to Liverpool after the war and worked as a radio technician for the BBC. He never talked about his wartime service except in the vaguest terms, and he never received official recognition for changing the course of the Battle of the Atlantic. The commendation Commander McIntyre had recommended was quietly filed away, probably because approving it would require acknowledging the unauthorized modification that had made it necessary. Sullivan's name appeared in no histories, no official accounts of convoy operations, no technical retrospectives on signals intelligence. The vertical direction finding antennas that became standard on Royal Navy vessels were credited to engineering teams and technical committees, with no mention of the operator who had first strung a wire from a masthead in a Newfoundland port while his ship was supposed to be in refit. The institutional Navy had absorbed his innovation while erasing his contribution, a pattern repeated countless times throughout military history when individual initiative conflicted with bureaucratic preference for orderly development. But among radio operators and signals intelligence specialists, Sullivan's story survived as oral tradition. Old veterans would tell new recruits about the operator who disobeyed regulations and saved a convoy, about the commander who had the courage to exploit unauthorized intelligence instead of suppressing it, about the night when the hunters became the hunted, because someone had thought to turn an antenna vertical. These stories served a purpose beyond nostalgia. They taught important lessons about the difference between following doctrine and accomplishing the mission, about when rules should be bent and when they should be broken, about the value of technical understanding and creative problem solving. The official histories might not mention Tommy Sullivan, but the informal culture of naval communications kept his legacy alive. His approach to radio direction finding influenced how generations of operators thought about their equipment, encouraging them to understand not just how to use the systems, but why they worked the way they did and how they might be improved. The technical principles Sullivan exploited became standard knowledge in signals intelligence. Polarization mismatch is now taught in every military communications course as a potential vulnerability that adversaries might create through equipment choices. Modern direction finding systems use multiple antenna polarizations specifically to avoid the blindness that Sullivan identified in World War II-era equipment. The vertical antenna he improvised has evolved into sophisticated arrays that can simultaneously monitor multiple polarizations and frequencies, providing comprehensive coverage of the electromagnetic spectrum. But the fundamental insight remains the same: understanding how your enemy communicates and building equipment optimized to intercept those communications provides decisive tactical advantage. Sullivan understood this intuitively in 1943, years before it became formal doctrine. The human cost of Sullivan's innovation is impossible to calculate precisely, but some rough estimates are possible. Convoy HX 224 carried 47 merchant ships with approximately 2,000 crew members and passengers. If it had suffered losses similar to previous convoys attacked by wolfpacks of comparable size, it would likely have lost 8 to 12 ships with casualties of 300 to 500 men. Sullivan's antenna prevented that loss entirely. As his modification spread through the escort groups over following months, the reduction in convoy losses saved thousands of additional lives. Merchant sailors who made it home instead of drowning in burning oil. Naval personnel who survived because their escorts detected submarines before torpedoes were fired. Even German U-boat crews were affected, as the increasing detection rate forced submarines to remain submerged longer, reducing their effectiveness and ultimately contributing to the defeat of a U-boat campaign. One antenna, one creative decision, rippling through the war in ways that would never appear in official casualty statistics. The story of Tommy Sullivan and his forbidden antenna illuminates a persistent tension in military organizations. Doctrine exists for good reasons. Standardized equipment and procedures enable coordination. Simplified training facilitate maintenance and prevent chaos. But doctrine can also become ossified, perpetuating approaches that no longer serve their purpose or that fail to adapt to changing conditions. The challenge is creating organizations that maintain necessary discipline and coordination while remaining open to innovation and creative problem solving. Sullivan succeeded because he found a commander willing to value results over regulations. But how many other potentially valuable innovations were suppressed because the right commander wasn't present? How many lives were lost because institutional resistance to unauthorized modifications prevented good ideas from being implemented? These questions have no comfortable answers, but they remain relevant to every military organization that must balance standardization against adaptation. In the decades after World War II, several historians and technical writers tried to document Sullivan's contribution, but they consistently encountered obstacles. Official records have been carefully sanitized to remove references to unauthorized equipment modifications. Officers who had known about the vertical antenna were reluctant to discuss it on the record, fearing retroactive disciplinary action or damage to their own historical reputations. Sullivan himself declined most interview requests, uncomfortable with attention, and perhaps aware that discussing his wartime actions might cause problems for others who had protected him. By the time serious historical research into convoy operations intensified in the 1980s and 1990s, many of the key participants had died, and the oral tradition that preserved Sullivan's story was fragmentary and contradictory. Some accounts credited him with saving dozens of convoys. Others suggested his role had been exaggerated. The truth, as usual, lay somewhere between the extremes, but pinning down exact details proved impossible. What remains undeniable is that Allied convoy operations improved dramatically in the spring and summer of 1943, that improved direction finding played a significant role in that improvement, and that the improved direction finding involved vertical antennas that had not been part of standard equipment earlier in the war. Someone developed that approach. Someone first realized that polarization mismatch was creating a vulnerability in standard equipment. Someone built the first improvised vertical antenna and proved it worked. The evidence, fragmentary as it is, points to Tommy Sullivan as that someone, an ordinary radio operator with extraordinary understanding of his equipment and the courage to act on that understanding even when it meant violating regulations. His story deserves to be remembered not because it's unique. Countless innovations have emerged from frontline personnel who saw problems and created solutions, but because it illustrates how wars are really won. Not just through grand strategy and industrial production, but through individual creativity, technical understanding, and willingness to challenge assumptions. Tommy Sullivan died in Liverpool in 1987 at the age of 67. His obituary in the local newspaper mentioned his wartime service in the Royal Navy, but provided no details. He was survived by his wife, 3 children, and 7 grandchildren. His effects included boxes of old radio equipment, technical manuals from the 1940s, and a logbook from his service aboard HMS Hesperus that his family didn't fully understand. The logbook contained page after page of technical notations, bearing measurements, and signal characteristics, along with occasional personal comments. One entry, dated March 18, 1943, simply read, "Convoy arrived safely. 0 losses. Method worked." That terse note was the only acknowledgement Sullivan ever made of his role in one of the most successful convoy operations of the war. He didn't need recognition or medals. He had done what needed to be done, saved lives that would otherwise have been lost, and that was enough. The broader lesson of Sullivan's story extends beyond military history into any field where innovation confronts established practice. Organizations face constant tension between the efficiency of standardized procedures and the necessity of adaptation. Too much standardization creates brittleness, an inability to respond to new challenges or exploit new opportunities. Too much flexibility creates chaos, with everyone pursuing individual solutions that can't be coordinated or maintained. The optimal balance varies depending on circumstances, but finding it requires leadership willing to distinguish between rules that protect essential functions and rules that simply reflect historical inertia. Commander McIntyre demonstrated that leadership when he chose to exploit Sullivan's unauthorized antenna rather than suppress it. He recognized that the potential benefit outweighed the procedural violation, and he had the courage to accept responsibility for that decision. Modern military organizations still struggle with similar tensions. Rapid technological change creates constant opportunities for frontline personnel to identify improvements that formal development processes haven't addressed. Commanders must decide when to encourage such innovation and when to enforce strict compliance with doctrine. The decision is rarely simple. Unauthorized modifications can create unexpected problems. Equipment that works brilliantly in one situation might fail dangerously in another. Individual innovations, however clever, must eventually be integrated into formal procedures or they remain fragile, dependent on specific personnel, and lost when those individuals transfer or leave service. Sullivan's vertical antenna succeeded not just because it was technically sound, but because it was eventually absorbed into formal doctrine, standardized, and widely deployed. The pathway from individual innovation to institutional adoption is crucial, and organizations that handle it well gain significant advantage over those that resist change or can't effectively scale successful experiments. The story also illuminates the hidden history of technological development. Official accounts typically credit innovations to formal research programs, engineering teams, and institutional processes. These accounts aren't necessarily wrong. Formal development is essential for refining ideas and producing reliable equipment at scale, but they're incomplete. Many important innovations begin as improvised solutions to immediate problems, created by people who aren't supposed to be inventors, but who understand their tools well enough to see possibilities others miss. The formal system then adopts these solutions, often without acknowledging their origins, and the individual contributors disappear from history. This pattern appears across industries and eras. The mechanic who modifies an engine and improves its performance. The nurse who develops a better wound treatment technique. The programmer who writes a utility that becomes essential infrastructure. These contributors rarely receive credit, but their impact shapes the trajectory of technological and procedural evolution. Tommy Sullivan represents all the uncredited innovators whose work made victory possible in World War II. The engineer who improved a tank transmission. The pilot who developed a new tactical approach. The logistics officer who found a way to speed up cargo loading. The factory worker who suggested a manufacturing improvement. Individually, these contributions might seem minor. Collectively, they provided the edge that determined outcomes. Wars are won not just by superior strategy or resources, but by the accumulated advantage of thousands of small improvements, most of which never appear in official histories. Sullivan's story survived through oral tradition because it was dramatic enough to be memorable. A single antenna saving an entire convoy makes for compelling narrative, but countless similar stories were lost simply because they lacked that dramatic clarity. How many other innovations disappeared because they worked quietly, preventing disasters that never happened rather than enabling visible victories? In the final analysis, the forbidden antenna that Tommy Sullivan strung from the masthead of HMS Hesperus represents something larger than one technical modification to one ship's equipment. It represents the eternal struggle between innovation and procedure, between individual initiative and institutional control, between the way things have always been done and the way they might be done better. Military organizations, perhaps more than any other type of institution, must navigate this tension constantly. They require strict discipline and standardized procedures to function effectively in the chaos of combat, but they also require adaptation and innovation to respond to changing threats and opportunities. The organizations that succeed are those that manage to encourage both, maintaining necessary discipline while remaining open to improvement. Sullivan's story demonstrates what's possible when that balance is achieved, when creative individuals are empowered rather than suppressed, and when leaders have the wisdom to recognize value even when it arrives through unauthorized channels. The vertical antenna itself was a simple thing, just copper wire and insulators arranged in a configuration that standard doctrine had overlooked. But simplicity doesn't diminish importance. Some of the most significant innovations in history have been elegantly simple, obvious in retrospect, yet invisible until someone thought to look at a familiar problem from a different angle. Sullivan looked at U-boat detection and asked why Allied equipment was optimized for the wrong polarization. The answer to that question, and his willingness to act on it despite regulations, changed the Battle of the Atlantic in ways that official histories have never fully acknowledged. 47 merchant ships reached Britain safely because a radio operator understood antenna theory better than the people who wrote the doctrine. 2,000 men survived who might have died. Thousands of tons of vital supplies arrived intact. The impact rippled outward through the war effort in ways that could never be fully traced. Tommy Sullivan never sought recognition for what he did. By all accounts, he was uncomfortable with attention and preferred to let his work speak for itself, in that he was typical of his generation, men and women who endured extraordinary circumstances and made remarkable contributions without expecting rewards or acknowledgement. They did what needed to be done because it needed doing, and that was sufficient motivation. Modern observers sometimes struggle to understand that mindset, living as we do in an era that emphasizes personal achievement and individual recognition. But Sullivan's perspective was shaped by different values. The convoy reaching Britain mattered. The lives saved mattered, whether his name appeared in reports or histories did not. That attitude, multiplied across millions of individuals, enabled the Allied victory in World War II. Not heroic posturing or dreams of glory, but quiet competence and determination to accomplish necessary tasks regardless of recognition.